Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other kids in Broken Rifle, Montana. While most teenagers spent their weekends at the mall or hanging out at the local diner, Sarah could be found in her grandfather's old barn, practicing with his vintage hunting rifles. The small town of barely 3,000 people didn't offer much excitement, but Sarah found peace in the rhythmic motion of loading, aiming, and firing at tin cans lined up on fence posts. Her passion started when she was 12 years old. Her grandfather, Roberto, had been a decorated veteran who served in Vietnam. After he passed away, Sarah's father inherited the ranch, but he had no interest in maintaining the old man's shooting range. Sarah, however, felt drawn to it like a magnet. She would sneak into the barn after school, carefully handling the well-maintained rifles her grandfather had left behind. At Broken Rifle High School, Sarah struggled to fit in. She wore simple jeans and flannel shirts instead of the trendy clothes other girls preferred. Her long black hair was usually tied back in a practical ponytail, and she rarely wore makeup. While her classmates talked about celebrity gossip and social media drama, Sarah preferred discussing the mechanics of firearms or sharing stories her grandfather had told her about precision shooting. The teasing started innocently enough. Jessica Walsh, the most popular girl in their junior class, noticed Sarah reading a gun magazine during lunch break. "Look at Annie Oakley over there," Jessica laughed to her friends. "Does she think she's going to join the army or something?" The comment spread quickly through their small school, and soon other students began calling Sarah names like Gun Girl and Rifle Rodriguez. Sarah tried to ignore the comments, but they stung more than she wanted to admit. She had always been proud of her shooting skills, but now she began to question whether her hobby made her weird. Her best friend Emma, one of the few people who understood her passion, encouraged her to stay true to herself. "Don't let them get to you," Emma would say. "They're just jealous because you have real skills while they spend all day taking selfies." The situation got worse when Brad Thompson, the captain of the football team and Jessica's boyfriend, decided to join in the harassment. During PE class, he would make exaggerated shooting motions whenever Sarah walked by. "Watch out, everyone," he would announce loudly. "The sharpshooter is here. Hope she doesn't bring her rifle to school tomorrow." His comments made Sarah's cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she never responded. She had learned from her grandfather that dignity meant holding your head high, even when others tried to tear you down. Sarah's father, Miguel, noticed his daughter becoming more withdrawn. She would come home from school quiet and subdued, heading straight to her room instead of spending time in the barn as usual. When he asked her about it, she would just shrug and say everything was fine. But Miguel knew his daughter well enough to recognize when something was bothering her. He had seen the same determined spirit in Sarah that his own father had possessed, and he worried that the cruel words of teenagers might crush that beautiful strength. One particularly difficult day, Sarah overheard Jessica and her friends talking in the hallway. "I heard she spends all her time playing with guns like some kind of weirdo," Jessica whispered loud enough for Sarah to hear. "My dad says girls like that usually have serious problems. Maybe she's planning something dangerous." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The idea that anyone would think she was dangerous or unstable made her feel sick to her stomach. That afternoon, Sarah walked to the barn with tears in her eyes. She picked up one of her grandfather's rifles, feeling the familiar weight in her hands. The metal was cool and smooth, and she remembered all the hours Roberto had spent teaching her proper form, safety protocols, and respect for firearms. "A gun is a tool," he used to say, "and like any tool, it's only as good or bad as the person using it. You have good hands and a good heart, mija. Never forget that." Standing in the dusty barn, surrounded by memories of her grandfather, Sarah made a decision. She would not let the cruel words of her classmates drive her away from something she loved. She would continue practicing, continue improving, and prove to herself that she belonged in this community just as much as anyone else. Little did she know that very soon, her skills would be put to a test that would change everything in Broken Rifle forever. Winter arrived early in Broken Rifle that year, bringing with it a harsh cold snap that froze the ground solid and covered the town in a thick blanket of snow. Sarah found comfort in the routine of her daily practice sessions, even though she had to wear heavy gloves that made handling the rifles more challenging. The barn provided shelter from the bitter wind, and the familiar ritual of setting up targets and checking her equipment helped calm her mind after difficult days at school. The harassment from her classmates had not decreased. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. Brad Thompson had started a cruel game where he would pretend to duck and cover whenever Sarah entered a room, claiming he was taking cover from the crazy girl. Other students found this hilarious, and soon half the school was participating in the joke. Teachers either didn't notice or chose to ignore what was happening, leaving Sarah to deal with the situation alone. During this particularly cold week in February, Sarah noticed something unusual happening around town. Several residents had reported strange incidents involving their pets and livestock. Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning chickens had been found scattered around her yard, clearly killed by some kind of predator. The Wilson family discovered their sheepdog injured and hiding under their porch, too frightened to come out even when called. Most disturbing of all, young Tommy Parker's beloved cat had gone missing entirely, with only a few tufts of fur and some blood found near the back fence. Sheriff Davis, a longtime family friend of the Martinez family, stopped by their ranch to discuss the situation with Sarah's father. Sarah listened from the kitchen as the two men talked in serious, hushed tones. "We think it might be a mountain lion," Sheriff Davis explained. "There have been tracks spotted near Miller's Creek, and the pattern of attack suggests a large predator. Problem is, we haven't seen one in these parts for nearly 15 years. Something must have driven it down from the high country." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "The drought last summer probably forced it to look for new territory." "What's the plan?" The sheriff sighed and adjusted his hat. "We've contacted the state wildlife department, but they're swamped with similar reports from 3 other counties. Could be weeks before they can send someone out here. In the meantime, I'm asking folks to keep their animals locked up tight and avoid being out alone after dark." At school the next day, news of the mountain lion spread quickly through the hallways. Students gathered in excited clusters, sharing exaggerated stories they had heard from their parents. Some claimed the animal was enormous, others insisted it had already killed a dozen pets. The drama and excitement provided a temporary distraction from the usual social hierarchies and gossip that dominated teenage life in their small town. Jessica Walsh, however, found a way to connect the mountain lion situation back to her favorite target. During lunch, she stood up at her table and announced loudly enough for the entire cafeteria to hear, "Well, at least now we know what Gun Girl is good for. Maybe she can actually hit something bigger than a tin can." Her friends erupted in laughter, and several other students joined in with their own sarcastic comments about Sarah's shooting abilities. Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but this time something was different. Instead of the usual shame and hurt, she felt a spark of anger. She had spent years perfecting her marksmanship, learning everything her grandfather could teach her about respect, responsibility, and precision. These students knew nothing about her skills or her character, yet they felt entitled to mock something they didn't understand. Emma leaned over and whispered, "Just ignore them. They're idiots." But Sarah was tired of ignoring them. She was tired of pretending their words didn't hurt. She was tired of hiding her abilities and passion because it made other people uncomfortable. For the first time since the teasing began, Sarah looked directly at Jessica and held her gaze without looking away. That afternoon, Sarah spent extra time in the barn, pushing herself harder than usual. She set up targets at increasing distances, challenging herself to maintain accuracy even as the shots became more difficult. Her grandfather had taught her that true skill wasn't just about hitting easy targets. It was about staying calm and focused under pressure, about making the difficult shot when it really mattered. As she practiced, Sarah thought about the mountain lion somewhere out there in the wilderness around their town. She wondered if the wildlife officials would really be able to handle the situation, or if the people of Broken Rifle would have to take matters into their own hands. She had never hunted anything larger than rabbits and prairie dogs, but her grandfather had always said that the principles remained the same regardless of the target size: patience, precision, and respect for the power you held in your hands. The wind howled outside the barn walls, and Sarah could hear the distant sound of cattle moving restlessly in the fields. Something was out there in the darkness, and she had a feeling that her skills might be needed sooner than anyone expected. The thought both excited and terrified her, but she knew she would be ready if the moment came. 3 days after Sheriff Davis's visit, the mountain lion struck again, and this time it was personal for many families in Broken Rifle. The Hendersons lost their remaining chickens in a single night, finding feathers and blood scattered across their entire property. The attack had been so violent and thorough that even experienced, Ranchers like Miguel Martinez shook their heads in disbelief when they saw the damage, or troubling were the reports coming in from the elementary school. Several children claimed to have seen a large, tan-colored animal watching them from the tree line during recess. Mrs. Patterson, the principal, initially dismissed these reports as overactive imaginations, but when 3 different teachers confirmed similar sightings on the same day, she decided to keep the children indoors during all outdoor activities. Sarah noticed the change in atmosphere throughout the town. Adults walked faster and looked over their shoulders more often. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk, even for short distances. The usual evening joggers and dog walkers had disappeared from the streets after sunset. Broken Rifle, which had always been a place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, suddenly felt vulnerable and exposed. At school, the mountain lion situation had temporarily overshadowed the usual teenage drama, but Jessica Walsh found new ways to target Sarah. During biology class, when Mr. Peterson mentioned predator behavior, Jessica raised her hand and said sweetly, "Mr. Peterson, shouldn't we ask our resident weapons expert about hunting dangerous animals? I'm sure Sarah has lots of experience with this kind of thing." The teacher looked confused, but several students snickered at the comment. Sarah felt her face flush, but instead of looking down at her desk as usual, she met Jessica's eyes directly. "Actually," Sarah said clearly, "tracking and hunting large predators requires completely different skills than target practice. Mountain lions are extremely intelligent and dangerous. Anyone who tried to hunt one without proper training and experience would probably end up getting themselves or someone else hurt." The classroom fell silent. It was the first time Sarah had ever responded directly to Jessica's taunts, and her calm, knowledgeable answer caught everyone off guard. Mr. Peterson nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right, Sarah. Predator hunting is serious business that should only be attempted by experienced professionals." Jessica looked annoyed that her attempt to embarrass Sarah had backfired. That evening, Sarah was in the barn practicing when she heard her father's truck pulling up to the house much faster than usual. Through the barn window, she watched him jump out and hurry toward the front door. Something was wrong. She quickly secured the rifle she had been using and ran toward the house, her heart pounding with worry. Miguel was on the phone with Sheriff Davis when Sarah entered the kitchen. His face was grim and he kept running his hand through his hair, which he only did when he was really stressed. "Yes, I understand," he was saying into the phone. "We'll keep Sarah inside after dark and make sure all the animals are secured. Call me if you need any help with the search." When he hung up, Sarah immediately asked what was happening. Her father sat down heavily in his chair and looked at her with serious eyes. "The mountain lion attacked the Morrison family's ranch this afternoon. It killed 2 of their calves right in broad daylight, less than 100 yards from their house." Jenny Morrison was hanging laundry outside when she heard the commotion. She saw the animal dragging one of the calves toward the forest. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The Morrison ranch was only 3 miles away from their property. If the mountain lion was hunting in broad daylight and getting that close to homes, the situation was much more serious than anyone had realized. "What did Sheriff Davis say?" she asked. Miguel shook his head. "The wildlife officials still can't get here for at least another week. They're dealing with similar problems all across the state, and they're understaffed. Sheriff Davis is organizing a search party for tomorrow, but he's worried that someone might get hurt if they encounter this animal without proper preparation." That night, Sarah lay in bed listening to every sound outside her window. The usual nighttime symphony of crickets and owls seemed muted, as if all the smaller creatures were hiding from something larger and more dangerous. She thought about Jenny Morrison hanging laundry, while a mountain lion killed livestock just a few yards away. The woman must have been terrified. Sarah also thought about the children at the elementary school, and how frightened they must be to see a large predator watching them during what should have been safe playtime. She imagined her own younger cousins in that situation and felt a surge of protective anger. This animal needed to be found and dealt with before someone got seriously hurt. Despite the fear that was spreading through the community, Sarah felt something else growing inside her as well. For years, she had been practicing and honing skills that most people in Broken Rifle didn't understand or appreciate. She had dedicated countless hours to becoming proficient with firearms, learning everything her grandfather could teach her about precision, patience, and responsibility. Now, for the first time, Those skills might actually be needed for something more important than hitting tin cans and paper targets. Sarah wasn't naive enough to think she could single-handedly solve the mountain lion problem, but she knew she was probably one of the best marksmen in the entire county. If the situation became desperate enough, her abilities might make the difference between life and death for someone in her community. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah made a silent promise to her grandfather's memory. If the time came when her skills were needed to protect the people of Broken Rifle, she would be ready. The teasing and mockery from her classmates suddenly seemed petty and insignificant compared to the real challenges that life could present. The search party organized by Sheriff Davis met at dawn behind the town hall. Sarah watched from her bedroom window as nearly 20 men gathered with rifles, flashlights, and walkie-talkies. Her father was among them, carrying the same rifle his own father had used for hunting deer. The men looked serious and determined, but Sarah could see the nervous energy in their movements as they checked and rechecked their equipment. Miguel had forbidden Sarah from joining the search, despite her protests that she was probably a better shot than half the volunteers. "This isn't target practice, mija," he had said firmly. "This is a dangerous animal that could kill a grown man. I need you to stay home and help your mother keep watch over the property." Sarah understood his reasoning, but it frustrated her to be left behind when she knew her skills could be valuable. At school that day, the building buzzed with excitement and fear. Most students had fathers, older brothers, or uncles participating in the search, and everyone was eager to share what they had heard at breakfast that morning. The teachers struggled to maintain normal lessons while students whispered constantly about the mountain lion and speculated about what the search party might find. During lunch, Brad Thompson stood up at his usual table and announced loudly, "My dad says they'll have that cat dead by nightfall. Real men don't need more than one day to handle something like this." He looked directly at Sarah as he spoke, clearly implying that her father and the other searchers were real men, while she was just a pretender with her target practice hobby. Jessica Walsh joined in with her own comment. "I heard they wouldn't even let Gun Girl join the search party. Guess her tin can shooting isn't as impressive as she thought it was." Several students laughed, but Sarah noticed that some of her classmates looked uncomfortable with the teasing. The mountain lion threat had made everyone more aware of how serious firearms skills could be in real situations. Emma defended her friend immediately. "Sarah's a better shot than anyone in this school, including your precious football players," she said angrily. "Just because the adults won't let teenagers join a dangerous search doesn't mean anything about her abilities." The exchange created tension in the cafeteria, with students taking sides based on their existing social alliances. That afternoon brought disappointing news. The search party returned empty-handed and frustrated. They had found several sets of tracks near Miller's Creek, but the mountain lion had proven too clever and elusive to corner. The animal seemed to know exactly how to use the rough terrain to its advantage, staying one step ahead of the human hunters. Sheriff Davis called off the search as darkness approached, planning to resume efforts the next day. Sarah's father came home exhausted and worried. Over dinner, he explained to his family how difficult tracking the mountain lion had proven to be. "It's not like hunting deer or elk," Miguel said. "This animal is smart and desperate. It knows we're after it now, which makes it even more dangerous. Cornered predators do unpredictable things." That evening, Sarah was in the barn cleaning her grandfather's rifles when she heard commotion coming from the direction of town. Car doors were slamming, people were shouting, and she could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles reflecting off the low clouds. Her heart raced as she secured the firearms and ran toward the house to find out what was happening. Miguel was already on the phone with Sheriff Davis, his face growing more serious with each passing moment. When he hung up, he turned to Sarah and her mother with grim news. The mountain lion just attacked the Parkers' property. Little Tommy was in his backyard looking for his lost cat when the animal appeared. His father managed to scare it off by firing a shotgun into the air, but the lion didn't run far. "It's still somewhere in the neighborhood." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Tommy Parker was only 8 years old, the same age she had been when her grandfather first taught her to shoot. The thought of that little boy facing a mountain lion in his own backyard made her feel sick with fear and anger. This situation was spiraling out of control, and the adults seemed unable to handle it effectively. The phone rang again, And this time it was Sarah's aunt calling to say that the elementary school had decided to cancel classes for the rest of the week. Parents throughout Broken Rifle were too frightened to let their children out of the house, and several families were considering leaving town temporarily until the mountain lion situation was resolved. As the evening progressed, more disturbing news arrived. The mountain lion had been spotted near the high school, then later near the grocery store parking lot. It seemed to be moving through populated areas with increasing boldness, possibly because it was hungry and desperate. The failed search attempt had apparently made the animal more aggressive rather than driving it away. Sheriff Davis made an announcement over the local radio station, asking all residents to stay indoors after sunset and to report any sightings immediately. He also requested that anyone with advanced firearms skills should contact his office, as the situation might require more experienced hunters than the volunteers who had participated in the day's search. Sarah looked at her father meaningfully when they heard this announcement. She had been shooting for 6 years and could hit a moving target at distances that impressed even experienced adult hunters. Her grandfather had taught her to track animals, understand their behavior, and remain calm under pressure. She was probably more qualified than most of the men who had spent the day searching unsuccessfully for the mountain lion. Miguel saw the determination in his daughter's eyes and shook his head. "No, Sarah, I know what you're thinking, but the answer is still no. This is too dangerous and you're still a minor." Sheriff Davis was talking about bringing in professional hunters from other counties, not recruiting teenagers. But Sarah was no longer thinking like a teenager worried about fitting in at school. She was thinking like her grandfather had taught her to think, like someone who took responsibility seriously and understood that sometimes difficult situations required difficult choices. The people of Broken Rifle needed help, and she might be one of the few people in town with the skills to provide it. The next morning brought news that changed everything in Broken Rifle. Sarah woke to the sound of her parents talking in urgent, worried voices in the kitchen. When she came downstairs, she found her mother sitting at the table with tears in her eyes while her father paced back and forth, clearly agitated about something serious. Miguel looked up when Sarah entered the room and sat down heavily in his chair. "There's been another incident," he said quietly. "The mountain lion attacked the Henderson property again last night, but this time Mrs. Henderson was outside checking on her remaining animals. She managed to get back inside the house, but barely. The animal actually charged at her before she could reach the door." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Mrs. Henderson was 73 years old and had been like a grandmother to many children in Broken Rifle. The thought of her being chased by a mountain lion was terrifying and infuriating at the same time. "Is she okay?" Sarah asked immediately. Her mother nodded, wiping her eyes. "She's physically fine, but she's very shaken up." The worst part is that the mountain lion damaged her front door trying to get inside the house. Sheriff Davis found claw marks on the wood and a broken window where the animal tried to reach through. "This isn't normal predator behavior. Something is seriously wrong with this animal." The situation had clearly escalated beyond what the local authorities could handle. Miguel explained that Sheriff Davis had contacted the state wildlife department again, demanding immediate assistance. However, the earliest they could send a professional hunter was still 5 days away. Meanwhile, the mountain lion was becoming increasingly aggressive and unpredictable, apparently losing its natural fear of humans. At school, the atmosphere was completely different from previous days. Instead of excitement and gossip, there was genuine fear and concern. Many students had not slept well, worried about strange sounds outside their windows. Several families had decided to send their children to stay with relatives in other towns until the crisis was resolved. The usual social dynamics seemed insignificant compared to the real danger threatening their community. Even Jessica Walsh seemed subdued and worried. During English class, she kept looking out the window toward the parking lot, clearly nervous about being in the building so close to where the mountain lion had been spotted. When the teacher asked her a question, Jessica had to be called twice before she snapped back to attention. The fear was affecting everyone, regardless of their usual confidence or social status. Brad Thompson, however, maintained his aggressive attitude despite the circumstances. During PE class, he announced loudly that his father was planning to take care of the problem himself if the authorities couldn't handle it. "Real men don't wait around for government officials when their families are in danger," he declared. "My dad has been hunting since he was 12 years old. One mountain lion isn't going to terrorize this whole town." Sarah felt a surge of frustration at Brad's typical arrogance. But she also recognized something else in his words. Despite his obnoxious delivery, he was expressing the same feelings she had been struggling with for days. The adults and authorities seemed unable to effectively deal with the mountain lion, while people with real skills were being sidelined because of their age or gender. After school, Sarah went directly to the barn and began preparing her equipment more seriously than ever before. She cleaned and checked each of her grandfather's rifles, selected the most appropriate ammunition for different scenarios, and practiced shooting positions that would be useful in rough terrain. She wasn't planning to disobey her father and sneak out to hunt the mountain lion, but she wanted to be absolutely ready if circumstances changed. That evening, those circumstances did change in a way nobody had expected. Sarah was finishing her practice session when she heard vehicles approaching the house quickly. Through the barn window, she could see Sheriff Davis's patrol car and 2 other trucks pulling into their driveway. Her father came outside immediately, and Sarah could tell from his body language that something significant was happening. She secured her equipment and hurried toward the house, arriving just in time to hear Sheriff Davis explaining the situation to her parents. "We've got a real problem," the sheriff was saying. "The mountain lion has been spotted heading toward the elementary school playground. There are still some children at the after-school program, and we need to get them evacuated safely." The other men with Sheriff Davis introduced themselves as volunteers from neighboring ranches who had come to help with the emergency. They were experienced hunters, but Sarah could see the worry in their faces. Tracking and cornering a desperate mountain lion near a school full of children was every parent's nightmare scenario. Miguel immediately volunteered to help with the evacuation, and Sarah watched as the men discussed their strategy. They needed to create a safe corridor for the children to be moved from the school building to waiting vehicles, while other volunteers positioned themselves to watch for the mountain lion and prevent it from getting closer to the playground. As the men prepared to leave, one of the volunteers from another ranch looked directly at Sarah. "You're Roberto Martinez's granddaughter, aren't you?" he asked. When Sarah nodded, the man continued, "I knew your grandfather well. He was one of the finest marksmen I ever met, and I heard he taught you everything he knew. We could use someone with those skills right now, especially someone who can stay calm under pressure." Sheriff Davis and Miguel both shook their heads immediately. "She's only 17, Sheriff Davis said firmly. "This is too dangerous for a minor to be involved in, regardless of her shooting abilities." But Sarah could see something different in the sheriff's eyes this time. The situation was becoming desperate enough that even he was starting to consider options he would normally reject. The volunteer persisted. "I'm not talking about putting her in harm's way, but if we need precise covering fire while those children are being evacuated, she might be our best option. Her grandfather could make shots that most of us couldn't even attempt." Sarah felt a surge of pride at the compliment, but also a heavy sense of responsibility. People's lives might depend on skills she had learned as a hobby in her grandfather's barn. The debate about Sarah's involvement continued for several tense minutes while precious time slipped away. Miguel was torn between his protective instincts as a father and his recognition that his daughter possessed skills that could genuinely help save lives. Sheriff Davis kept checking his radio, receiving updates about the mountain lion's location that made everyone increasingly nervous. Finally, Mrs. Patterson's voice crackled through the radio with urgent news that changed everything. "The mountain lion is now visible from our classroom windows," she reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. "It's pacing back and forth at the edge of the playground, about 60 yards from the building. The children are scared but staying quiet. We need help immediately." Sheriff Davis made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Sarah," he said, looking directly at her with serious eyes, "if your father gives permission, I want you to come with us. But you'll only be providing backup support from a safe distance. You will not engage the animal unless absolutely necessary to protect someone's life. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded solemnly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like her grandfather's heavy hunting jacket. Miguel looked at his daughter for a long moment, seeing not the teenager who had been teased at school, but the young woman who had dedicated years to mastering skills that were desperately needed now. "Mija," he said quietly, "if you do this, you must promise me you'll follow every instruction exactly. No heroics, no taking unnecessary risks." "I promise, Papa," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She ran to the barn and quickly gathered her grandfather's most reliable rifle, the scope he had specially adjusted for her eye, and enough ammunition for any scenario they might encounter. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over while her mind focused on the task ahead. The convoy of vehicles moved through town with unusual urgency, passing houses where families peered anxiously through drawn curtains. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of her father's truck, checking and rechecking her equipment while mentally reviewing everything her grandfather had taught her about shooting under pressure. Breathe steady, aim small, and remember that the shot you don't take can be just as important as the one you do, she whispered, repeating Roberto's favorite advice. When they arrived at the elementary school, Sarah could immediately see the mountain lion through the chain-link fence surrounding the playground. The animal was magnificent and terrifying at the same time, easily weighing over 120 pounds with powerful muscles visible beneath its tawny coat. It moved with the fluid grace of a perfect predator, but there was something wrong with its behavior. Instead of fleeing from the human activity around the school, it seemed almost fixated on the building itself. Sheriff Davis quickly organized the volunteers into positions around the school perimeter. Sarah was stationed behind his patrol car, approximately 80 yards from the playground with a clear line of sight to the mountain lion. Her father positioned himself nearby with his own rifle, ready to provide support if needed. The other volunteers spread out to create a protective barrier between the animal and the evacuation route. Through the school windows, Sarah could see the small faces of children pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with fear and fascination. Mrs. Patterson was moving between classrooms, quietly organizing the students and preparing them for evacuation. The after-school program had 12 children that day, ranging in age from 6 to 10 years old. Sarah felt a fierce protective anger as she thought about how frightened those kids must be. The mountain lion suddenly stopped pacing and turned toward the school building. Its ears perked forward in an alert posture. Something had caught its attention, possibly the sound of children's voices or movement inside the building. Sarah adjusted her scope and took careful aim, not intending to shoot, but wanting to be ready if the situation deteriorated. Quickly, Sheriff Davis's voice came through the radio as he coordinated with Mrs. Patterson. "We're going to evacuate through the side door facing away from the animal. The children will move in single file to the waiting bus, with adults surrounding them on all sides. Everyone needs to move quickly but quietly. If the mountain lion charges, do not run toward the children. Draw its attention away from them at all costs." Sarah felt her heart pounding as she watched the school's side door open slowly. Mrs. Patterson emerged first, followed by the smallest children holding hands in pairs. The group moved with impressive discipline considering their age and fear, walking quickly but quietly toward the yellow school bus parked 30 yards away. Sarah kept her rifle trained on the mountain lion, which remained focused on the main building and hadn't yet noticed the evacuation happening on the opposite side. Everything went smoothly for the first few moments. Half the children had safely reached the bus when disaster struck. One of the smaller boys, probably no more than 6 years old, tripped and fell hard on the asphalt. His knee scraped badly and he let out a cry of pain and fear that carried clearly across the playground. The mountain lion's head snapped toward the sound immediately, its predatory instincts triggered by what sounded like an injured animal. The big cat began moving toward the evacuation route with purposeful, deadly intent. Sarah could see its muscles bunching as it prepared to leap over the playground fence. Sheriff Davis and the other volunteers shouted and waved their arms, trying to distract the animal, but it seemed focused solely on the crying child and the group of people around him. "Sarah," Sheriff Davis called urgently, "if that animal jumps the fence, you may be our only shot at stopping it before it reaches those kids. Can you make that shot if you have to?" Sarah's mouth felt dry, but her hands were steady on the rifle. She had never shot at anything larger than a coyote, and never in a situation where missing could mean someone's death. But she thought about her grandfather's teachings about responsibility and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice calmer than she felt. "I can make the shot." The mountain lion crouched low, preparing to spring over the fence toward the children who were now crying and clustering around their fallen classmate. Sarah took a deep breath, settled her crosshairs just behind the animal's shoulder, and waited for Sheriff Davis's command. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah watched the mountain lion gather itself for the leap that would carry it over the fence, toward the terrified children. the animal's powerful haunches bunched with muscle, its yellow eyes locked on the crying boy who had fallen. Mrs. Patterson was trying to shield the children with her own body, while other adults scrambled to get between the predator and the students. Now, Sarah, Sheriff Davis shouted. Sarah's training took over completely. She felt her grandfather's presence beside her as she controlled her breathing, steadied her aim, and gently squeezed the trigger just as Roberto had taught her thousands of times before. The rifle's crack echoed across the schoolyard, and the mountain lion jerked violently in mid-leap, tumbling to the ground just short of the fence. The shot had been perfect, hitting exactly where Sarah had aimed. The mountain lion lay still, and the immediate danger to the children was over. For a moment, complete silence fell over the scene as everyone processed what had just happened. Then Mrs. Patterson's voice broke the quiet as she quickly organized the remaining children and rushed them safely to the bus. Sarah lowered her rifle with shaking hands, suddenly feeling the full weight of what she had just done. She had never killed anything larger than small game before, and the magnitude of the moment overwhelmed her. Her father reached her first, pulling her into a tight hug and whispering words of pride and comfort in her ear. Sheriff Davis approached more slowly, his expression mixing relief with amazement. "That was an incredible shot, Sarah," he said quietly. "You saved those children's lives today. That animal would have reached them if you had hesitated even a second longer." The other volunteers gathered around, all wanting to express their gratitude and admiration for her skill and courage. As the excitement began to die down, the veterinarian who had been called to examine the mountain lion made a disturbing discovery. The animal had been suffering from a serious illness that explained its aggressive, unusual behavior. It was sick and desperate, which made it far more dangerous than a healthy mountain lion would have been. Dr. Mitchell explained that the disease would have made the animal increasingly unpredictable and violent until it either died or was stopped. The news spread through Broken Rifle faster than wildfire. By evening, everyone in town knew that Sarah Martinez, the quiet girl who had been teased for her shooting hobby, had saved a dozen children from a deadly predator with a single, perfectly placed shot. The local newspaper wanted to interview her. The sheriff's department officially commended her actions, and families throughout the community called to express their gratitude. At school the following Monday, Sarah's world had completely changed. Instead of mockery and cruel jokes, she was greeted with respect and genuine admiration from her classmates. Students who had never spoken to her before came up to thank her personally, especially those who had younger siblings in the after-school program. Even the teachers looked at her differently, seeing not just a student but someone who had proven herself capable of extraordinary courage under pressure. Jessica Walsh approached Sarah during lunch, looking genuinely humbled for perhaps the first time in her high school career. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I've been horrible to you for no good reason. And now I realize how wrong I was. What you did was amazing, and I'm sorry for all the mean things I said about your shooting." The apology seemed sincere, and Sarah accepted it gracefully, though she knew their relationship would never be the same. Brad Thompson's reaction was more complicated. He seemed torn between admiration for Sarah's heroic actions and embarrassment that a girl he had mocked had accomplished something more impressive than anything he had ever done. Eventually, he managed to approach her with a grudging compliment. "That was a hell of a shot," he admitted. "I don't think I could have made it under that kind of pressure." Sarah thanked him politely but could see that his ego was struggling with the reality of her superior skills. The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A week after the incident, an elderly man Sarah didn't recognize approached her at the grocery store. He introduced himself as Colonel William Hayes, a retired military officer who had served with her grandfather in Vietnam. "Roberto used to talk about his granddaughter all the time," Colonel Hayes said with a warm smile. "He said you had the steadiest hands and the calmest heart of anyone he'd ever taught to shoot. I think he would be incredibly proud of what you accomplished." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she thought about her grandfather's reaction to recent events. She knew Roberto would have been proud, not just of her marksmanship but of her willingness to step up when her community needed help. All the hours they had spent together in the barn, all his patient instruction about responsibility and courage, had led to this moment when her skills truly mattered. The mountain lion incident became a turning point for Sarah in ways that extended far beyond her social status at school. She realized that the things that made her different from her classmates were actually her greatest strengths. Her dedication to a skill that others didn't understand had prepared her for a moment when that skill could save lives. The teasing and mockery that had once hurt so deeply now seemed insignificant compared to the knowledge that she had made a real difference in the world. Sarah continued practicing in her grandfather's barn, but now she carried herself with quiet confidence rather than defensive uncertainty. She had proven to herself and her community that being different wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. The girl who had been teased in Broken Rifle had become the woman who saved Broken Rifle, and she would never forget the lesson that sometimes the most unexpected people are exactly who the world needs most.